A young orphaned girl living in a frontier settlement discovers an injured Native American girl by the river and risks everything to help her cross to safety. What begins as a simple act of compassion sets in motion a chain of events that will forever change her life as she awakens to find 30 native warriors standing at her cabin door at dawn, carrying gifts that will transform her understanding of family, belonging, and the true meaning of courage. Sanasika Funitasa. I never expected that Tuesday morning in September 1847 would be the day everything changed. I was 10 years old, living alone in the small cabin that had been my parents' before the fever took them 6 months earlier. The other settlers in our small Wyoming Territory outpost looked after me as best they could, but I was fiercely independent, maybe too much so for a child. I woke before sunrise, as I always did, to the sound of my empty stomach growling. The autumn air was crisp, and frost covered the wooden planks of my porch. I wrapped my mother's old shawl around my shoulders and stepped outside to check the rabbit snares I'd set the night before. The settlement was quiet, except for the distant sound of the Snake River flowing about a quarter mile through the woods behind our cabins. I walked the familiar path through the pine trees, my bare feet crunching on fallen needles and leaves. The first 2 snares were empty, but I wasn't discouraged. Patience was something I'd learned quickly after becoming an orphan. That's when I heard it, a soft whimpering sound coming from the direction of the river. I froze, listening. It came again, barely audible over the water's flow. My heart started racing. Could it be a wounded animal? Or worse, someone in trouble? Despite my fear, I crept toward the sound, pushing through the thick undergrowth. What I found by the riverbank changed everything. A Native American girl, probably around my age, lay crumpled against a fallen log. Her long black hair was matted with blood, and her deerskin dress was torn and stained. She was conscious but clearly in pain, her dark eyes wide with fear when she saw me approaching. For a moment we just stared at each other. I'd seen Native Americans before, they sometimes traded with our settlement, but I'd never been alone with one, especially not an injured child who looked as scared as I felt. She tried to sit up and winced, pointing across the river with a trembling hand. She spoke in a language I didn't understand, but her tone was urgent, pleading. Then she said something I did recognize. "Brother is brother." I looked across the river where she was pointing and saw smoke rising from what must have been a camp. Her people were there, waiting for her, but the river was deep and fast-moving here, and she was clearly too hurt to swim across. My mind raced I should run back to the settlement and get help from Mr. Henderson or one of the other men. That would be the sensible thing to do. But looking at this girl's frightened face, I knew she didn't have time to wait. She needed help now. I knelt down beside her and pointed to myself. "Sarah," I said clearly. Then I pointed to her with a questioning look. She understood and touched her chest. "Ayana," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I nodded and looked around frantically. There had to be a way to get her across. Then I remembered about 50 yards upstream, there was a place where a large tree had fallen across the river after a storm last spring. The trunk was thick enough to walk on, though it would be dangerous, especially with an injured person. I tried to explain my plan through gestures, pointing upstream and mimicking walking. Ayana's eyes followed my movements, and she nodded weakly. Getting her to her feet was harder than I expected. She leaned heavily on me, and I could feel how she struggled with each step. We moved slowly through the underbrush, and I found myself talking to her even though she couldn't understand most of what I was saying. "It's going to be okay," I told her. "We'll get you home to your brother. Just hold on to me." When we reached the fallen tree, my heart sank. It looked much more treacherous than I remembered. The bark was slippery with morning dew, and the river rushed loudly beneath us. One wrong step would mean certain death for both of us. But Ayana looked across the river toward the smoke from her camp, and I saw such longing in her eyes. I thought about how I would feel if I were hurt and far from home, well, if I still had a home with family in it. "We can do this," I said, as much to convince myself as her. I went first, stepping carefully onto the log and testing my balance. Then I reached back to help Ayana. She was braver than I was, I realized. Despite her injuries and obvious pain, she never hesitated. We moved inch by inch across that fallen tree. Halfway across, Ayana stumbled, and for a terrifying moment I thought we were both going to fall, but I grabbed her arm and steadied us both, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "Don't look down," I told her, though I was speaking more to myself. When we finally reached the other side, I helped her down from the log, and we both collapsed on the riverbank, breathing heavily. Ayana looked at me with tears in her eyes and touched my face gently, saying something in her language that sounded like gratitude. I helped her stand, and we walked toward the smoke. Soon I heard voices calling out, men's voices, urgent and worried. 3 Native American men came running toward us through the trees. One of them, who looked older than the others, scooped Ayana into his arms, and I could see the relief flood his face. He spoke to her quickly in their language, and she replied, pointing at me several times. All 3 men looked at me with expressions I couldn't read. The older one, who I assumed was her brother, stepped toward me. I backed away instinctively, suddenly aware of how alone I was and how far from my own people, but he moved slowly, keeping his hands visible, and when he spoke, his English was clear. "You helped my sister," he said simply. "You risked your life for her." I nodded, not trusting my voice. He studied my face for a long moment. "What is your name, little one?" "Sarah," I managed to say. "Sarah McKinnon. I am Running Wolf," he said, "and I will not forget what you have done today." As they prepared to leave, Ayana reached into a small pouch at her belt and pulled out a small carved wooden bird. She pressed it into my hand and smiled at me through her tears. I watched them disappear into the forest, holding the little bird carving tightly. I had no idea that this simple act of helping someone in need would set in motion events that would change my life forever. If this story has touched your heart so far, tell me from which part of the world you're reading this. The walk back to our settlement felt longer than usual. I kept turning the small wooden bird over in my hands, running my fingers along its smooth, carved surface. It was beautiful work, more detailed than anything I'd ever seen. The tiny creature seemed almost alive, with intricate feather patterns and bright obsidian eyes that caught the morning light. When I finally emerged from the forest, I saw Mrs. Henderson hanging laundry behind her cabin. She looked up and waved, then did a double take when she noticed my torn dress and the scratches on my arms from pushing through the undergrowth. "Sarah McKinnon, what on earth happened to you?" she called out, hurrying over with her wet hands still dripping from the wash basin. I hesitated. How could I explain what had just happened? In our settlement, relationships with the native tribes were complicated. Some families, like the Hendersons, believed in peaceful coexistence. Others, like the Pratts, who lived on the far end of our settlement, viewed any Native American as a threat to be feared or eliminated. "I fell by the river," I said simply. "Got tangled up in some thorns." Mrs. Henderson examined my scratches with the practiced eye of a woman who'd raised 5 children. "These look like they need cleaning. Come inside, and I'll tend to them properly." I followed her into her warm cabin, breathing in the familiar sense of fresh bread and lye soap. As she cleaned my cuts with a wet cloth, I found myself thinking about Ayana. Was she safe with her people now? Were they treating her injuries? "Mrs. Henderson," I said carefully, "do you think the native people around here are good people?" She paused in her cleaning and looked at me thoughtfully. "Well, I suppose they're people just like us, Sarah. Some good, some not so good. Why do you ask?" "Just wondering," I said, but I could tell she wasn't entirely satisfied with my answer. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I found myself walking to the river more often, always carrying the wooden bird in my pocket. Sometimes I would sit by the water and look across to where Ayana's people had their camp, wondering if she was recovering well. The other children in our settlement had always treated me with a mixture of pity and awkwardness since my parents died. I was the orphan girl who lived alone, too proud to accept charity, but clearly struggling to survive on my own. But now I had a secret that made me feel different, special even. I had helped someone, really helped someone, and it mattered. On Friday evening, I was sitting on my cabin's front step, watching the sun set behind the mountains, when Mr. Henderson approached. He was a tall, weathered man with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work. "Sarah," he said, settling down beside me on the step, "mind if an old man sits with you for a spell?" I shook my head, scooting over to make room. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds, crickets beginning their nightly chorus, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft murmur of families settling in for the night. "Mrs. Henderson tells me you've been asking questions about the native folk," he said finally. My stomach clenched. Had I given myself away somehow? "I was just curious," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded slowly. "Curiosity's a good thing in a young person. Shows you're thinking about the world around you." He paused. "You know, I've lived in this territory for 8 years now. Seen a lot of changes, met a lot of different kinds of people." "What are they like?" I asked, genuinely wanting to know. "The native people, I mean." Well, Mr. Henderson said thoughtfully, the Shoshone tribe that lives in these parts, they're mostly peaceful folk. They've been living on this land for generations, know it better than any of us ever will. They have their own ways, their own beliefs, but they're not so different from us when it comes to the things that matter most. What things? Family, taking care of their children, wanting to live in peace and have enough food to eat. He looked at me sideways. They help each other when times get tough, just like we do in our settlement. I thought about Running Wolf's face when he saw his sister, the relief and love so clear in his expression. Do you think they would help someone who helped them? Mr. Henderson was quiet for so long, I thought he might not answer. Then he said, I think people generally remember kindness, Sarah, and I think they usually find a way to return it one way or another. That night, I lay in my small bed, staring at the wooden bird, which I'd placed on the windowsill where the moonlight could touch it. I thought about Mr. Henderson's words and wondered if Running Wolf really would remember what I'd done for his sister. The weekend passed uneventfully. I tended my small garden, mended my torn dress, and helped Mrs. Peterson preserve the last of her late-season vegetables in exchange for a share of the food. It was the kind of arrangement I'd learned to make, trading my labor for what I needed to survive. Sunday evening, as I was banking the coals in my fireplace for the night, I heard something that made me freeze. It was a sound I'd never heard before, a rhythmic drumming coming from the direction of the forest. Not loud, but persistent and somehow meaningful. I crept to my window and peered out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but the drumming continued for maybe 10 minutes before stopping abruptly. The silence that followed seemed deeper than usual, pregnant with possibility. I spent most of that night awake, listening and wondering. Was it some kind of ceremony, a celebration, or something else entirely? Monday morning dawned clear and cold. I woke earlier than usual, feeling restless and strangely expectant. As I dressed and prepared for the day, I kept glancing out my windows, though I wasn't sure what I expected to see. I was just finishing a meager breakfast of cornbread and water when I heard voices outside, excited, urgent voices coming from the center of our settlement. I stepped out onto my porch and saw several of my neighbors gathered together, all looking toward the forest and talking in hushed, urgent tones. Mrs. Henderson spotted me and beckoned me over. "Sarah," she called, her voice strained with anxiety. "You need to stay close to the cabins today. Don't go wandering off toward the woods." "Why?" I asked, joining the group. "What's happening?" Mr. Pratt, whose face was red with agitation, turned to me. Henderson spotted signs of a large native war party moving through the area last night. Could be 30 or more warriors. My heart stopped. 30 warriors? Could this have something to do with helping Ayana? Where are you watching this story from? I'd love to know which city you're joining me from as this mystery unfolds. The words 30 warriors echoed in my mind as I stood frozen among my neighbors. My hand instinctively moved to my pocket where I always kept the wooden bird, and suddenly it felt as heavy as a stone. "Now, hold on, Pratt," Mr. Henderson said, his voice steady but concerned. "I said I found signs of movement. Could be hunters, could be a traveling party. No reason to assume they mean us harm." "No reason?" Mr. Pratt's voice rose sharply. "A group that size moving at night. That's war party behavior, Henderson, and you know it." Mrs. Peterson clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "What should we do? Should we send someone to Fort Bridger for help?" I felt sick to my stomach. If Running Wolf had come with warriors, was it because of me? Had I somehow put my entire settlement in danger by helping his sister? "Sarah, you look pale as a ghost," Mrs. Henderson said, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Don't you worry, child. We've dealt with uncertainties before." But I was worried. Terrified, actually. Not just for myself, but for all these people who had looked after me since my parents died. The Hendersons who shared their meals with me, Mrs. Peterson who taught me to preserve food, even gruff Mr. Pratt who always made sure my firewood pile was stocked before winter storms. "I should get back to my cabin," I mumbled, backing away from the group. "Absolutely not," Mr. Henderson said firmly. "Until we know what's what, you're staying with us. Go pack a few things and come to our place." I wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes told me it wouldn't do any good. I trudged back to my cabin, my mind racing. As I gathered my few belongings, I kept looking out my windows toward the forest, half expecting to see painted warriors emerging from the trees. The wooden bird seemed to burn in my pocket. Should I tell Mr. Henderson what had really happened? Should I confess that I might be the reason for whatever was coming? I spent that day in the Henderson cabin, helping with chores but unable to concentrate on anything. Mrs. Henderson kept giving me worried looks, and I knew she could tell something was bothering me beyond the general threat. "Sarah," she said finally, as we were preparing the evening meal, "is there something you want to tell me about what happened by the river the other day?" I nearly dropped the bowl I was holding. "What do you mean?" "Child, I've been watching you for months. You're not the kind to fall into thorns by accident. You're too careful for that." Her voice was gentle but persistent. "And you've been asking questions about native folks, carrying yourself different like. Something happened, didn't it?" Before I could answer, we heard shouting from outside. Mr. Henderson burst through the door, his face grim. "They're moving closer," he announced. "Johnson spotted them about a mile out, heading this way. Definitely a war party, painted for battle, armed with bows and tomahawks." My blood turned to ice. This was my fault, all of it. "We need to barricade the doors and windows," Mr. Henderson continued. "Get the rifles ready. Send young Tommy to ride for Fort Bridger." Mrs. Henderson was already moving, pulling heavy wooden shutters across the windows. "Sarah, help me with these blankets. We'll hang them over the windows for extra protection." But I couldn't move. I stood there with tears streaming down my face, the wooden bird clutched so tightly in my hand that its carved edges cut into my palm. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry for what, child?" Mrs. Henderson asked, pausing in her preparations. "It's my fault," I said louder, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I helped one of them, a girl who was hurt by the river. I helped her get back to her people, and now they're coming, and it's all because of me, and you're all going to die, and it's my fault." The room went completely silent. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson stared at me, and I could see them processing what I'd just confessed. "You helped an injured native girl?" Mr. Henderson asked slowly. I nodded miserably and pulled out the wooden bird, showing it to them. "She gave me this. Her brother said he wouldn't forget what I'd done. I thought it was good, but now..." Mr. Henderson took the carved bird from my trembling hands, examining it carefully. His expression was unreadable. "Sarah," he said finally, "this is beautiful work. Look at these details, the craftsmanship. This isn't something you give to an enemy. But the war paint, the weapons, could mean a lot of things." Mrs. Henderson interrupted gently. "Maybe we shouldn't assume the worst just yet." Before anyone could say more, we heard something that made us all freeze. The sound of many footsteps approaching the cabin, heavy, measured steps that spoke of a large group moving with purpose. Mr. Henderson grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, carefully peering through a gap in the shutters. His wife positioned herself near the door with a loaded pistol, while I cowered behind the kitchen table, certain that I was about to watch these good people die because of my actions. "How many?" Mrs. Henderson whispered. "Hard to tell in the darkness," her husband replied. "But it's a substantial group. They're not trying to hide their approach." That struck me as odd. If they meant to attack us, wouldn't they try to be stealthy? We waited in tense silence as the footsteps came closer and closer. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, so loud I was sure everyone else could hear it too. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside our cabin. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. No war cries, no arrows through the shutters, no demands for surrender, just silence. Then, clear and strong through the wooden door, came a familiar voice speaking English. "We seek the girl called Sarah McKinnon. We mean no harm to any in this place. We come with honor." It was Running Wolf. Mr. Henderson looked at me with raised eyebrows. "I think, young lady, there's more to this story than you've told us. If you've ever lived through something like this, leave me a comment telling me which country you're listening from." Mr. Henderson looked at me, then at his wife, then back at the door where Running Wolf's voice had just spoken my name. The silence stretched between us like a taut rope. "Sarah," Mr. Henderson said quietly, "I think you need to tell us everything right now." My hands were shaking as I told them the complete story. How I'd found Ayana injured by the river, how I'd helped her cross on the fallen log, how her brother had promised he wouldn't forget. Mrs. Henderson listened with her hand over her heart, while her husband's expression grew more thoughtful with each detail. "You risked your life for a stranger," Mrs. Henderson whispered when I finished. "A child who couldn't even speak your language." Before I could respond, Running Wolf's voice came through the door again. "Sarah McKinnon, we know you are here. Please, will you speak with us? We have traveled far to honor you." Mr. Henderson stood slowly, still holding his rifle but no longer pointing it toward the door. "Honor you," he repeated. "That doesn't sound like a war party to me." "But the paint, the weapons," I started. "Could be ceremonial," Mrs. Henderson said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Sarah, what if they're not here to hurt us? What if they're here because of what you did for that girl?" My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Mr. Henderson looked at me seriously. "It's your choice, child, but I think we need to open that door." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Mr. Henderson slowly unlatched the door and pulled it open, keeping his rifle visible but lowered. Mrs. Henderson stayed close behind him, and I peered around them both. What I saw took my breath away. There were indeed about 30 Native American warriors standing in our settlement, but they weren't positioned for attack. Instead, they were arranged in a respectful semicircle around our cabin, and each man held something in his hands. Blankets, carved items, bundles of what looked like food. Running Wolf stepped forward. In the lamplight, I could see that the paint on his face wasn't war paint at all, but intricate patterns that seemed almost ceremonial, beautiful even. He was older than I remembered, maybe in his 20s, with kind eyes that reminded me of Ayana's. "Sarah McKinnon," he said, his English careful but clear. "5 days ago, you saved my sister's life. You risked everything for someone you did not know, someone your people might call enemy. This is not something we forget." I stepped out from behind the Hendersons, my legs feeling like water. Is Ayana okay?" Running Wolf's stern expression softened into a smile. "She is well. She asked me to give you this." He reached into a leather pouch and pulled out another wooden carving. This one a small horse, even more detailed than the bird. When he placed it in my hands, I could feel that it was still warm from being close to his body during their journey. "But that's not why we came," he continued. "We came because what you did, it showed us something about your heart. In our tribe, when someone shows such courage and kindness, especially to protect a child, we have traditions, ways to honor such people." One of the other warriors stepped forward, an elderly man with silver-streaked hair and deep lines around his eyes. Running Wolf spoke to him in their language, then turned back to me. "This is Medicine Bear, our chief. He wishes to speak with you." Medicine Bear approached slowly, and I could see the wisdom in his weathered face. When he spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, and Running Wolf translated. "He says that you have shown the heart of a true protector. That age does not matter when courage is real. He says..." Running Wolf paused, listening as the chief continued. "He says that you are no longer alone in this world." I didn't understand what he meant, but I could feel tears starting to form in my eyes. Medicine Bear spoke again, longer this time, and his voice carried weight and ceremony. As Running Wolf translated, I realized that something profound was happening. He says that in our tribe, we believe that some people are born to certain families by accident of blood, but others are chosen by the spirits to belong where they are most needed. You showed that you belong among people who value life and kindness above all else. The chief reached into his own pouch and pulled out something that made me gasp. A beautiful necklace made of small carved animals, each one different, strung on a leather cord. "This was made by the women of our tribe," Running Wolf explained. "Each animal represents a different virtue: courage, kindness, wisdom, strength. They worked on it for 3 days after Ayana told them what you had done." As Medicine Bear placed the necklace around my neck, I felt its weight like a blessing. But he wasn't finished. He spoke again, his words carrying a formal, almost ritualistic tone. He says that from this day forward, you are considered a daughter of our tribe. Not to take you from your people, but to make sure you always know you have family. That if you ever need anything, food, shelter, protection, you need only ask. I was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. These people who barely knew me were offering me the one thing I had lost when my parents died, the promise that I would never be truly alone. "There's more," Running Wolf said gently. He gestured to the other warriors, who began stepping forward one by one, each placing gifts at my feet. Blankets, dried foods, carved tools, warm moccasins, even a small bow with arrows sized for someone my age. "These are to help you through the winter," Running Wolf explained, "but also to remind you that you are cared for." As the sun began to rise behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Medicine Bear spoke one final time. His words were simple, but Running Wolf's translation made my heart soar. He says, "Welcome to the family, little sister. May you always have the courage to help those who need it, and may you always find help when you need it most." Standing there in the dawn light, surrounded by 30 warriors who had traveled through the night to honor a 10-year-old orphan girl, I finally understood what Mr. Henderson had meant about people remembering kindness. Sometimes, one small act of compassion can change everything. Tell me from which corner of the world you're experiencing this story. Your comments mean everything to me.